Welcome, Internet. Today I wanted to talk about a special subject, a subject that's very close to my heart and is very important, i.e., the relationship between mental health professionals and schizoidness. So, here, when I mean schizoidness, I don't necessarily mean the schizoid individual or how treatment or what type of treatment is brought up, but even the idea itself of schizoidness. So, in this idea of schizoidness, I include the whole spectrum of the schizoid personality, ranging from the DSM version of it to more covert schizoids that might pass as something else and can have a life with a partner, friends, family, but it's always going to be in a way withdrawn. So here, when I'm going to talk about schizoidness, I'm going to speak about the whole spectrum, all right? I just want to make it very clear. So I wanted to make this video because in France, schizoidness is relatively unknown by mental health professionals. Like, if you ever talk about it with someone that is a mental health professional, be him a psychologist, psychiatrist, psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, the best they might know about is a DSM version of it. And in France, it is very, very, very rare for someone to ever get the diagnosis of schizoid personality disorder. Incredibly rare. So why is it so rare? It's rare for many, many reasons. The first and foremost reason is that the French have never really put any emphasis on schizoid defense mechanisms, schizoidness, or schizoid adaptations. They've always interpreted it very differently from the rest of the world. And secondly, it's also because, strangely enough, the French have gone in a direction which is very typical for France, but is not necessarily shared by other countries, that fundamentally everything is more generalized, globalized in the French mental health system. So what I mean by that is that this is due to the mark of psychoanalysis on France. Because as you might know, might not know, France is virtually, was at least, a very, very pro-psychoanalytic society, at least in mental health issues, which, at least in my eyes, was a good thing, but also a bad thing for many reasons. And one of the casualties of that approach was the schizoid personalities, because there was a fundamental problem. Because of psychoanalysts are very hesitant, if not against the idea of a diagnosis. And the idea of diagnosing those personalities is something that's not really approved of. It's kind of frowned upon. So you get that first complexity. Then there's a second complexity that for a very long time, the major influence in French psychoanalysis was Lacan and Lacanism. And in Lacan and Lacanism, there's three main types of personalities. There's the perverse personality, the neurotic personality, and the psychotic personality. And for you who study psychology, psychoanalysis, or even if you have a little bit of knowledge, you'll know that there's a fourth or a fifth category missing in those three ones. Mainly everything that is borderline and everything that's autistic. So you already get the gist of why schizoidness is absent. It's because, not that the schizoid are autistic or borderline, but because they're not plainly neurotic and they're not absolutely psychotic either. So psychoanalysts have, in France, pushed the diagnosis away. So it isn't that they weren't necessarily aware, because that's also another argument you could say that, oh yes, but it's more the Anglo-Saxons that theorized it, which is fundamentally true. You're absolutely right. Fernburn, Guntrip, and Greenberg, Nancy McWilliams, all of them more Anglo-Saxon than French. So yes, there's a cultural distinction, but the French are not necessarily ignorant of those theories. But what you have to understand is that there's a very chauvinistic aspect to French psychoanalysis, which is virtually like we do it best. So thus we don't need the others. We are completely self-reliant on our own version of it. The problem is with that version is that there's a lot of gaps that are not filled. So historically, there's been a very bad way of dealing with sins, because the problem with schizoidness is that it was mainly considered by French professionals in the worst case scenario as pre-morbid for psychosis and, let's say, it's schizophrenia. Like that was the real big how can I say, word to use it. Basically, schizoid for a long time just means, and I even saw that work in France, it means one single sin. It means pre-schizophrenic. That's pretty much it. That's the understanding of the French of the phenomenon. And if you're gonna use it in the Harry Guntrip, Fernburnian way, that's where the trouble is gonna start, because other professionals aren't gonna follow you on that, or they're gonna be very dubious on what you're talking about. Because for the French, what we would consider in the Anglo-Saxon countries as schizoid personality is for them a form of borderline. So to understand this, for them, borderline is a general term. It's not just borderline personality disorder as we would understand it. It's something that's more global, that integrates schizoidness within it. Anything that has to do with issues of attachment is, in France, has been considered for a very long time per essence borderline. Be it I can say a noisy form of borderline, which would be borderline personality disorder proper, where people are gonna act out, have abandonment issues, have bonds but then attack them and then regret that attack, guilt, and so on and so forth, and what we know of borderline personality disorders. But for the French, being schizoid is the mirror of borderline. Like, that's a continuum. You get borderline, which is the noisy expression of what borderline personality is, and on the other end you get the schizoids, which also have abandonment anguish and anxiety according to the French model, and also are basically, because they're not engaging in relationships, because they're afraid of being abandoned, fundamentally. So the problem is with these models is that they're very limited, because if you're going to consider schizoid as negative borderlines, right, you're going to leave out a lot of subtlety. And the same goes with the idea that the schizoid is innately psychotic per essence, that's like what is waiting to be triggered is schizophrenia, and basically you're just buying yourself time with a schizoid personality. It's also very wrong, but that's where we're at in France. And in France, or you're a borderline or you're a psychotic. And for some very old professionals, mental health professionals, you don't even have borderline, you just have plain out psychotic that hasn't triggered yet. So it can be quite of a mess. So that's why in France there's curious, if not disgusting way of putting that category away, that we never talk about it, we never think about it. The only people that are going to give it any attention whatsoever are the people that follow the DSM. However, they're going to have, as we stated time and time again in these videos, a very caricatural version of it. So it's not about fundamentally the essence that's going to be there. It's going to be the symptoms that are going to manifest themselves. And even then, even when it's that version of it, it's often understood as like, you have to be careful because schizophrenia is not far away. So even in that knowledgeful, let's say, perspective, you don't really get a real true understanding of schizoidness. And that's, I feel, a shame. So that's one of the reasons why the French do not know about it. And even if they do, like the rare people that do know about it might be very skeptical, or might be very, very against, very anti that idea of schizoid, thinking that you got it wrong, that it's pre-psychotic, or that you're just talking about borderline in a new fancy language and you're just making things up. So it can be quite complicated to talk about it with colleagues that are not open-minded. And for those that are open-minded, there is this very interesting way of rephrasing it. Like for them, for the more open-minded people, they're gonna say, yeah, okay, let's say there is some such a thing as schizoid personality disorder as you're describing it, like not the DSM, but really what you're saying. Or let's say there is a schizoid dynamics. Well, then that's just trauma. We're just talking about trauma there. Therefore, we can treat it with EMDR. We can treat it with, and the personality is going to change or has the potential to change, which is also kind of wrong. I mean, not that a schizoid person is gonna always feel isolated, that there can be communications, people can improve. I'm not saying that. But this idea that you treat trauma and then all the personality just changes is wrong also. There is something that's fundamentally a resistance against the idea of schizoidness being a plurality and something that's so much more present. There is a real, also virtually a disinterest in those areas, as if like the models we had now in France were good enough, where I feel that they're lacking, and you can't really change it because the mental health professionals are not very open to it. And that's on the whole a big problem with French culture itself. Like, even if we went meta, is that the French are reluctant to change because there's this idea of French exceptionalism that's still very present. It's starting to change, but it's still very, very present, meaning that there is that idea that we are French, thus our culture is at the top, and everything that comes from other cultures is at the bottom. And they're not going to state it like that, right? No one is going to be that chauvinistic in your face. But that's really what they're thinking. And being trained in the universities, you also get that semblance of French exceptionalism. And in the authors we study, in the way we are brought up as therapists, so it's still there, in a way. And I'm not saying it's not changing, because I'm already starting to see that there's a more openness in it. But what you have to understand is that, as such, it's very, very complicated to just bring in new ideas and for new ideas to get adopted in the French system. And the same goes with schizoidness. The dynamics we understand in the Anglo-Saxon countries and perhaps other parts of the world as being schizoid are not understood like that by the French. And that's really, I think, a shame, because for a lot of people that they get misdiagnosed, they get mistreatment, not mistreated in the fact that they're not abused, but they don't get the right treatment or the right perspective of the clinician, because the clinician is all going to be focused on other personality disorders and try to build a pseudo way of working with, for example, borderline, when it's not necessarily the same work you do with a borderline patient and with a schizoid patient. So they're trying to use models that are not going to fit, or trying to treat something like trauma, which can be very real for schizoid people, but not the whole picture. So they're just going to focus on that, thinking, oh yeah, once we heal that, everything's going to be better. Personality is going to just change. I mean, I'm really caricaturing, because it's much more nuanced. I don't want to strawman my colleagues, because they're very smart people. But it is the vibe of the idea. So it's symptom focused, or it's misguided in a way. And in this, I feel that a lot of patients have lost time and investment in trying to find the right type of perspective. And that's where also I think a lot of people start, for example, people I've worked with, start to question also the idea of autism, which also might be linked. It's not both, contrary to what people believe, both can go together. They're not mutually exclusive. But autism comes also to answer certain schizoid dynamics. And they might come together, or they might be different. But that's also something that's starting to really gain traction in France. There's this idea of autism, which is important. And I think that people should understand that and be open to it. And therapists also, because unfortunately, it's still something that's very questioned, this idea of autism. And in people that don't have severe forms of it. So it's still something that's very questioned. But if you bring schizoid dynamics, I think that right now in France, for the layman, the only category in which they can identify with if they're schizoid or have schizoid dynamics is autism, because that's the closest thing we have to a schizoid diagnosis. And for me, it's fundamentally complicated because I really feel that both are very distinct, and that we French people would benefit from this whole new category that's not here for now. In the same way, the other categories are well established. And for me, that's something that's terrible, because I think a lot of our patients would benefit from an approach that's more focused on them, an approach that's not purely symptom-based, but more trying to understand the essence of the individual and trying to help the individual with their relational struggles, because they're still there, even if, let's say, the person with schizoid personality disorder is at a very extreme where you have the feeling that they don't care anymore. That's not necessarily true, that people are not necessarily completely absent. They can be improvements, they can be degradations. It's all very dynamic, right? It can go one way or another. And I think that basically it's an important discussion to have. And I think that in the future, I might even do French videos to try and make people sensitive to that aspect, because unfortunately it's still very unknown in France, and it's still something that needs to be exposed. It needs, in terms of exposure, it needs to be exposed to others. It needs to be in a way sold to other mental health professionals, because right now it's something that's unknown, and it's something that's going to have a lot of pushback against it, because the model works without it. And if the model works without it, why would we add an extra cog to the machine? That's the way basically I see it, at least from my perspective of a psychologist in France. It doesn't mean, of course, that I'm right or that I'm speaking absolute truth. I'm just talking about my experience and the reasoning I have behind my experience here in France. And to the extent of my knowledge, I do think that it might also be the case in other countries, though because I am based here, I mainly have people here and work with colleagues here, so it might be the same in your country, or it might be completely different. Like, I'm not trying to generalize the state of France to the whole wide world, because I don't think it can be. And there might be correlations with my experience, there might not be. Fine, it's fair. And even if you're a French mental health professional, you might have been exposed to it, you might disagree with me, and that's also fine. Here I'm not trying to speak the truth, I'm just trying to share an experience and what I think and what I believe on the phenomena. So I hope you find this video interesting, and if you have any questions, comments, or things you would like to ask, as always, please feel free. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye.